Hello and welcome back to a new episode of Two Peas in a Pod. I'm Aaron Herskowitz.
And I am Sam Liebens. It's good
Hi,
to
Sam.
good to be with you again, Aaron, in our comfortable little pod.
It is quite nice, nice and cozy.
Nice and cozy. And today we're going to be talking about negative emotions, the world of emotions, and helping our children to, you might even say, grow into their emotions.
Much like peas in a pod.
Much like peas in a pod. So shall we dive right into the Torah corner?
That sounds like a wonderful idea. I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Sam.
All right, fabulous. So the piece of Torah I wanted to share with you is a classic piece of Rambam in his Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Deot, chapter 2. And he says that in some ways he is appropriating an Aristotelian notion called the golden mean, which is all about living a life that's very balanced between different character traits that you could have. But he roots it, as you would expect him to do, in Torah sources. So he says, Mishu Ba'al Chema, somebody who is, the translation I have here from Eliyahu Turga says, a wrathful man, Ba'al Chema. Omrim lo lahanvig atzmo, she'im huka v'kulal lo yargish klal. He should be advised, I'll carry on just in the English, he should be advised to train himself to feel no reaction, even if he's beaten or cursed. And he should follow this course of behavior for a long time until the anger is uprooted from his heart. The man who's full of pride, ga'ava, should cause himself to experience much disgrace. Let me just make sure that was ga'ava. Yeah, it is ga'ava. Yeah. He should sit in the lowliest of places, dress in tattered rags, which shame the wearer and the like, until the arrogance is uprooted from his heart and he returns to the middle path, which is the proper path. When he returns to the middle path, he should walk in it in the rest of his life. And one should take a similar course with each of the other traits. A person who's swayed in the direction of one extreme should move in the direction of the opposite extreme and accustom himself to that for a long time until he's returned to the proper path, which is the midpoint for each and every temperament. Elsewhere, there's a little bit more I want to share with you before we jump into an analysis. Elsewhere, the Rambam likens this to if you had a tree that was bending to the right, and you wanted to fix the tree to be upright rather than bending over to the right, then you need to lean it all the way over to the left. You need to kind of overcompensate. And once you've done that for a certain amount of time and you let go, then it will be straight. So he's saying a similar thing about our emotions, or at least our character traits, that if you are inclined naturally towards one extreme type of emotion, you should habituate yourself to the opposite extreme, but the aim is to be balanced between various. But then he says, and it's kind of a bit difficult because the two examples he's given, which you might translate as anger and arrogance, but in the next halacha 3 of chapter 2 of Hilchot Deot, he says, "V'yesh deyot she'asur lo la'adam linhog behen b'veinonit, ela yitrachek min hakatzeh ha'echad ad hakatzeh ha'acher." He says there is an exception to this Aristotelian principle where it's forbidden for a person to just be on the middle path, but instead they have to be extreme. V'hu govalev, it's arrogance, she'ein derech hatova sheyeh adam anav bilvad, because actually it's not enough to just be humble. Rather, he should be of a very humble spirit, and his spirit should be exceedingly lowly. That's why it says, describing Moshe, who should be a paradigm for us, he's described in Sefer Bamidbar as anav ma'od. Anav bilvad. It doesn't just say he's humble, it says he's very humble. And he also alludes to a Gemara in Masechet Sota that says that a person who has arrogance in his heart, there's no room there for God to coexist with with the arrogance that fills up an arrogant person's heart. So if it's arrogance is your problem, you need to go all the way to the other. No, sorry. It's not that with other emotions, the idea is you should be, or character traits in general, the idea is you should try and navigate a middle path. But with arrogance, you need to go all the way. Everybody needs to go all the way. Even if you don't have a problem that needs fixing, everyone needs to go all the way to extreme humility, he says. And the second character trait, which he says, again, ironically, given the last halacha, the second character trait, which he says is it's forbidden to be on the middle path regarding, but you have to be extreme about, is anger. He says anger is also an exceptionally bad quality. It's fitting and proper that one move away from it and adopt the opposite extreme. He should school himself not to become angry, even when it's fitting to be angry. And interestingly, for parenting, he gives a piece of parenting advice. If he should wish to arouse fear in his children and household, or within the community if he's a communal leader, and he wishes to be angry at them to motivate them to return to the proper path. So that's to say, if there's some kind of pedagogic purpose for being angry, the Rambam says he should present an angry front to them to punish them, but he should be inwardly calm. He should be like one who acts out the part of an angry man in his wrath, but is not himself angry. And once again, for this deviation from the Aristotelian middle path, the Rambam brings a Gemara. He quotes the Chachamim who say, anyone who becomes angry is like one who worships idols. They also said, there's another Gemara that says, whenever one becomes angry, if he's a wise man, his wisdom leaves him. And if he's a prophet, his prophecy leaves him. The Rambam then adds, the life of the irate is not true life. So there we have the Rambam talking about one of the negative emotions that we're going to discuss. And he takes a very extreme position. He says that anger is never justified. At most, the pretense of anger can be justified, but one should try to adopt an inward calm in the midst of the anger. This goes much further than Aristotle, and Aristotle's idea is that in all emotions and in all character traits you should navigate a kind of middle path. The Rambam adopts that, but says, based on what he takes to be the weight of the halachic tradition, based on the weight of these Gemaras that he quotes, that there are some exceptions, and anger is one of them. You should never, ever be angry. I would like to hear your thoughts on that in a moment, Aaron, but I would point out that in the philosophy corner, we'll come back to this question and ask whether we really agree with the Rambam that anger is always a bad thing, and maybe a question what his definition of anger may have been. But there you go. That's the Rambam I wanted to share with you. Aaron, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think it's very interesting because of the fact that there are other negative emotions, and it seems like it's interesting because, right, is the Rambam talking about character traits or emotions, right? You toggled back and forth between the two of them.
Yeah.
And is there also...
And that's because he does, because his examples are a mixed bag. And
yeah,
just one thing that I'm going to steal from the philosophy corner that I was saving till there, but I'll say it now, is even this word emotion is a quite new word to the English language. In fact, it was only in the 19th century that it came to mean exactly what it means in English. The ancients had many words, passions, affects, dispositions, but they didn't have one overarching word for what we would call emotions. So it might be unsurprising that the Rambam is listing together arrogance and anger, which for us seem like they're from disparate categories. Arrogance being perhaps a character trait and anger being an emotion. But anyway, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think that a question that your explanation triggered in my mind, which I think relates to, I also wanted to bring a supplementary Torah source, which I realized there is also a Rambam on that as well, is that if we were to follow the Rambam's advice with regards to completely eliminating anger, I would suggest that then when someone is trying to use anger in an educational way, they would not actually be able to, because of the fact that if we're saying that the Rambam is talking not just about never behaving in an angry way, but eliminating the ability to feel anger, then you can't call upon it at different points. There's I'm ethically limited in my ability to explain psychological testing here too much. But I'll say that there is in one of the psychological tests, there's something that measures aggression. And in general, we are of the mind that aggression is not a great trait for people to have. And but often we look to see if there's just the tiniest bit of aggression. Because if there's none, then that also can be a sign of a lack of mental health, right? Somebody who's just like a doormat and is not going to stand up for themselves if they're being bullied or attacked, or if they need to try and achieve something that might also not be a great place to be.
It's interesting you say that, Aaron, because one of the things that's very controversial about the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, or was very controversial at the time, is that he doesn't quote minority opinions very often. He just quotes the Gemara as he sees the bottom line. So over here, he's quoted the Gemara in Sota about arrogance, and he takes the opinion that he takes to be the halachic bottom line, which is no arrogance ever. But actually, in the Gemara, there is a de'ah over there in Masechet Sota, I think is Daf Hey, where it says, well, actually, a tipa of arrogance is necessary because again, you'd be like a doormat if you didn't have any. So you've got to get rid of it all, apart from just enough to basically be human. And the Rambam doesn't cite that minority opinion. That's
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know it's a minority opinion. It's just an opinion in the Gemara that he doesn't cite.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe a good segue to the supplementary source. Is I wanted to there's a verse, a pasuk in chapter 20, verse 26, that reads, at the end of the list of forbidden relations, Hashem says, "You shall be holy to me, because I am holy," translating kadosh as holy, just for the purposes of this discussion right now. "And I have distinguished you from amongst the nations to be unto me." And the Midrash Halacha, the Sifra, which actually Rashi quotes on this pasuk, quotes Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says, how do we know? Minayin shelo yomar adam efshi lilbosh shatnez. How do we know that a person should not say, I do not desire to wear shatnez, to wear the forbidden mixture of wool and linen, or efshi le'echol basar chazir, or I do not desire to eat pork, or efshi lavo al ereva, or I have no desire to engage in forbidden relations. How do we know that a person should not say any of these statements, but rather aval efshi uma aeseh ve'avi shebashamayim gazar aleikach? How do we know that a person should say, I do desire these things, but what can I do? My Father in heaven has decreed that I shall not do these various actions. Talmud Damar ve'avdil etchem min ha'amim liot li. The Torah tells us in this verse, I have distinguished you from amongst the nations to be unto me. Nimtza poresh min ha'avera u'mikabel. That because of this motivation, this is what causes a person to separate from sin and accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven. So often this is quoted as, even though the source says, right, I do desire it, often we quote it as saying, efshi ve'efshi, right? The double lashon of I very much do desire all these various actions. And there are other sources that distinguish between different types of mitzvot.
A famous Rambam in the Shmone Prakim where he quotes it.
So that's the Rambam that I want, or a part of that Rambam. So where he the way that he brings this Gemara is he says shehem, as part of the discussion, which I think also relates to what you were talking about in terms of part of the philosophical discussion about whether it's better to have a desire to do bad and overcome it, or whether it's better to just have that desire not exist or have been extinguished from you. So as part of that discussion, the Rambam says that even more so in terms of what Chazal's opinion is, shehem tzivu liot ha'adam mit'aveh le'avirot, that they commanded that a person must desire to sin, right? Ad shehizhiru milomar shani b'tivei lo etaveh lizot ha'avira, until they forbade us from saying that I, in terms of my natural tendencies, have
God forbid that I could eat pork.
So in other words, it's not just that, this is the proper thing, but it's a rabbinic command that one should not speak in this way. That you I don't know if he feels that you should go ahead and try and fan the flames of this desire or anything of that sort. But in other words, that the Rambam views it as a valued principle that a person should not just have this desire, but also recognize it and express it. And I thought in this context of a story that I mentioned, I think in our episode that we did in season 1 about kavod, about respect to one's parents, a story of our Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Amital Zatzal, who in a sicha, a famous story, in a discussion with overseas students, he told them that Ani ohev kavod, right? I like honor. I like receiving respect and honor. And afterwards, one of the students came up to him and said, "Oh, I don't think you meant that. What you meant was this. What you meant was that." And he's like, "Okay, if you say so, that's what I meant." And then at the end of this student, this was I think it was a student from the Southern Hemisphere on the MTA program. And then at the end of his first year of studying yeshiva, he was about to go home, and he came up to Rav Amital and he told him, "I realized what you were saying. I like kavod also." And I think I mentioned in the episode that the story, the way that I heard it is very cryptic, right? In other words, what's the message here? Or like, what does Rav Amital mean when he says, "I like honor and respect"? So one way that I take away from it is about the importance of recognizing these very human desires and emotions we have, as opposed to saying, no, one must strive to not want honor and respect, but or maybe you can strive to not want that, but you first need to recognize that you do, right? That you have this tendency, that you like it, recognize that there's dangers in that, and you need to perhaps be careful in terms of not being motivated by wanting to seek more and more honor and respect from others. But you need to be human.
To put the Rambam in context, he makes it clear that he thinks this is only the case for certain sorts of sins. He doesn't think you should want to rape, murder, and pillage. That would be bad if you wanted those things, right?
Yes. So the distinction between mitzvot that are is that the distinction between mitzvot ben adam and ben adam sichliot versus not? Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So that's a different distinction than between ones that are directed towards God versus directed towards.
That's right.
Although there is overlap between those two categories.
There is. But his idea is that if you go back to that Mechilta that you quote, or Sifri that you quote, if you look at the examples, it's wearing shat, eating
eating pig,
and certain sexual sins. And the Rambam's thought is that if we didn't have the Torah, we wouldn't know not to wear shatnez, we wouldn't know not to eat pig, and the precise boundaries of which sexual relations are allowed and which are forbidden would also not be clear to us if it wasn't.
Although that's the one could argue on that last point, right? There is a certain
I know
there's an interpersonal aspect of that, and discussion how much is it societal versus.
That's right, but even in halakha it is today. What's forbidden to a non-Jew and what's forbidden to a Jew in terms of sexual relations are slightly different. So you could potentially imagine that it would have been different. So Rambam, I suppose, true to the source that I gave, would say there are some areas where it's right and proper to recognize these desires you have and not pretend they're not there, recognize them or whatever. But there are some areas of life where it's just not appropriate to have those desires.
Yeah.
The question is, perhaps, where do we draw these, where and how do we draw these boundaries? There was something else you made me want to respond with, but it's gone. Maybe it will come back.
I'm sure it will.
Okay. Shall we go to the I always like to alternate. So shall we go to the psychology corner? Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Buckle in.
I'm ready. Okay.
Psychology corner.
All right. I feel like every single time I start talking about psychology corner, I start with Donald Winnicott and or attachment theory. So I do want to talk about them a little bit first, but I want to bring in other things too, because I don't want to just be a broken record only talking about the two of them. So in terms of parenting with regards to negative emotions, when we were discussing this over WhatsApp, I kept putting negative in quotation marks because of the fact that, I mean, we experience a whole range of, let's say, from a childhood perspective, like when we talk about recognizing different emotions, the first stage in development is recognizing positive versus negative, right? In other words, how do you feel, good or bad? So someone who doesn't develop further in an emotional standpoint cannot differentiate between different positive and negative emotions, right? So what is bad? Bad is angry, sad, disgusted, betrayed, insulted, hurt, ashamed, guilty, right? It's its own range of emotions. People who, over time, we're supposed to also help our children become more differentiated in their emotions, but that's the very first distinction between good and bad. But the reason I was putting in quotation marks is that the negative emotions, as we'll talk about a little bit later, also have positive aspects to them as well. So in terms of these two theories, so I spoke a lot about Donald Winnicott in his views on parenting, on the importance of parents being good enough parents, Dafka not being perfect parents, because if you're perfect, when we have our episode maybe about helicopter parenting, we'll talk about the pitfalls of that, but being good enough, which allows children to develop their own sense of strength and on the one hand being protected, but on the other hand being frustrated enough that they do develop their own abilities and resilience. And part of that is creating what he calls a holding environment, where what the parent is doing is that they're creating sort of the safe space for their child to experience the range of emotions, to think about things, to play with things, to not necessarily do things right away. I encounter this a lot in the therapy room where I'll talk about someone will be dealing with a dilemma, a question, whatever, and sometimes they'll feel, okay, I talked about it with Aaron, so by the next meeting I have to do what it, like, let's say a fear of having a conversation with a spouse or a parent, right? And trying then in the session to imagine what it would be like, right? What would that conversation go like? A difficult conversation. So they feel, okay, well, if we talked about it, that means by next week I have to have done it. and say like, yeah, no, like we don't have to. I mean, maybe if you want to, you can, but part of the development is also recognizing that we can think about things, we can talk about them, we can imagine them, we can experience them without needing to go ahead and act on them yet. And that's also in terms of the negative emotions, right? What we need to do is we need to, as parents, enable our children to experience the full range of human emotions, to recognize that there are emotions that even though we would call them negative emotions, they are not forbidden in the sense that, oh, we can never not only not talk about them, but not experience them. That we're taking these emotions, making them so scary that they can't be experienced. And where you have families or environments where that is experienced, so then, that emotion becomes a stumbling block for people later on in life, right? If you're talking about a family where anger is forbidden, where you're not allowed to be angry, so that doesn't work. There's no such thing as not actually being angry, right? We're getting back to the Rambam. Are we talking about anger as an emotion, anger as an experienced emotion, anger as behavior, whatever he's talking about? But you can't just say like, no, there's no such thing as anger. Anger doesn't exist. It's not in my lexicon, because of the fact that then either you're talking about someone who's going to be bottling up their anger and it's eventually going to come out and they're going to explode, or you're talking about someone who's taking this like life, whatever. Not getting too much into Freud today, but this powerful urge, things that can motivate them, push them to achieve and acquire, stand up for themselves, right, and things like that, like I spoke about in the previously, and you just like flip the off switch, right? So it's that
reminds me of the Torah source
that from personality.
You've reminded me of the Torah source that I forgot to. I was reading.
Amazing. So we're in a good stopping point because I was about to talk about attachment theory. So go ahead.
Yeah, which is just, there's a Gadata in Masechet Avodah Zarah where it describes the end of prophecy, and that the sages or the men of the Great Assembly kind of arranged with God that, okay, prophecy will stop, but can we also get rid of the Yetzer Hara altogether?
Oh yeah. Oh, maybe it's also in Avodah Zarah. It's in Sanhedrin on Samech Daled.
Yes, that's what
everyone was learning. Everyone learned Daf Yomi and learned Zikr.
Yeah, but what's the system that you're learning that helps you remember the pages?
It's a mnemonic technique where every page in the Gemara has a certain visual cue, and then they take three things from the daf and fit it into that like visual cue. So Samech Dalet.
Anyway, in this
secret agent, whatever. Okay, yeah.
That's definitely in Sanhedrin, and I think it's in Avodah Zarah too. I may be mistaken.
Very well could be. Haven't gotten up to it in Daf Yomi yet.
The taking away of the Yetzer Hara was disastrous, because nobody had kind of the drive to reproduce even, and it would have
that was they got rid of the one for idolatry for
that's right. So
and
the kind of compromise was,
but then they're like, oh, let's also get rid of the one for forbidden relations.
That's right, and it was a bad thing, right? So
yeah,
we no longer have the Yetzer Hara for idolatry, great, but we still have a Yetzer Hara. And had we not had one, the Gemara is explicitly implying we would be worse off. So this connects to what you're saying in the psychology corner, that you could quash a person's drive altogether by trying to stamp out what you take to be negative emotions. You could end up stamping out their drive.
Yeah. I feel like we spoke about that Gemara recently, or maybe I was speaking to someone else about it. Okay, fine. Yeah, but it's a great one in terms of our discussion here, in terms of the importance of recognizing. I'm here doing the air quotes. I hope people can hear it in my voice too, of the negative drives that one has, and how there is importance to them as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say, like, in terms of Winnicott, even if there's not importance to them, it's important that there not be things that are forbidden from feeling at all, right? Because then that makes them larger than life also.
Yeah.
Which maybe also connects to the imagery of that Gemara in terms of the urge, what it looks like. But whatever, we'll get into that right now. In terms of attachment theory, Mary Ainsworth, John Bowlby, what they speak about is the importance of developing a sense of secure attachment with a caregiver from the earliest stages of development, and how that also enables us to develop secure attachment, safe relationships with others as we get older. And part of that, with regards to negative emotions, is that as parents, part of our goal should be to enable children to express negative emotions within the context of the relationship, which can create a sense of secure attachment. Meaning, right, a child can be angry and express that anger, and yet still love their parent and be loved by them. As opposed to, let's say, the moment that a child has a tantrum, the parent loses it and yells at them and says that's it, or leaves them, right? And there is that just. We'll talk about boundaries in terms of that in a second, but just that just the feeling of anger is forbidden, and feeling angry means that the relationship is destroyed, that there's no more relationship, there's no more love. So that A, shows how dangerous anger can be in terms of the child, and B, also shows how fragile relationships are, right? So it's more likely to lead to a certain type of insecure attachment, right? Now, the relationship is not strong enough to survive these difficult and intense emotions. And not just in terms of anger, also in terms of jealous, right? In other words, I can be jealous of someone else and not be pushed away, right? Not be, I can't believe you're feeling that emotion towards your brother or sister, whatever it is. But yeah, we'll talk about it when we talk about the practical aspect. Because if we don't develop that, so like I said, that the emotions become not just difficult, which they are difficult emotions, but we feel that the emotions need to be denied. Okay, so I wanted to talk about Winnicott and attachment theory, but I did want to, like I said, talk about one more theory, and I'll talk about a fourth one.
Just to comment on what you've said so far, I suppose a kind of interesting dimension here is that, according to some psychologists, as far as I'm aware, I'm stepping into your turf of expertise, but I learned from Dan Zahavi, who's a really great philosopher whose work integrates a lot of contemporary experimental and other forms of psychology. Dan Zahavi, when he talks about relationships in general, he thinks that they are sustained by the ability to share emotions. So from very early on, when the caregiver looks into the eyes of the baby and there's a moment of joint attention, there's a kind of, he argues, there's an emotional state that the child and the parent are in that is shared, in a sense that the parent is aware that the child is feeling what the parent is feeling, and the parent is aware that the child is feeling what. This is kind of this sharedness to their emotions. I suppose if that's part of our understanding of relationships, then you might think that the relationship is really threatened when one person feels an emotion that the other doesn't. Right, I'm angry right now and you're not angry. So does that mean that the relationship's over? Does that mean that, or I'm sad right now and I don't see that you're sad? So I can see how navigating that, teaching a child that the relationship is secure even when different emotions are being felt, challenging emotions are being felt. It's really important because it can seem to the child that the relationship is broken altogether.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely a stage of development, also recognizing that differences in emotional experiences don't mean that there's not a connection, that there's not a relationship. And I may have also mentioned this in the past, but when I talked to, or I guess I haven't done it more recently, but in the past, when I would learn with before they would get married, would talk about the age-old advice of a secret to a happy marriage is never go to bed angry. We speak about this. Does this sound familiar?
I'm not sure, but it's worth doing chazara.
And it's nice, right? It's a wonderful thing to never go to bed angry, but if you're in a point of tension, and especially early on in the marriage, right, and where you don't have necessarily all the tools yet to resolve conflict, and you can often find yourself at 1 or 2 in the morning, like you don't even know what you're arguing about anymore.
Yeah,
but that it can be, yeah. So it's wise to go to bed, and also doing it not out of anger, right? Not saying, well, we'll talk about this tomorrow, we'll talk about it in the morning, but saying, you know what, we're not in a good place right now. It's hard for me, it's hard for you, but I realize that we don't have the resources right now to resolve it. I think it'll be a lot better if we sleep. In my mind, that's a sign of strength of the relationship, because you're saying that our relationship is so strong that it can contain this anger, this hurt, this whatever it is we're experiencing for 8 hours or a day, right? But like, so that's also, I think, related to this point.
Yeah.
Okay. So so in terms
we're going to
of
move on to a new theory.
Yeah, the last one, and then I'll mention another in the practical aspect too. Okay. So I think I have mentioned also this theory that I work with often, called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. That's one of the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot more user friendly, I find, both for clients and for therapists. And the A of acceptance, when we're talking about it, let's say in this context, is learning to accept difficult emotions.
It's
part of the therapeutic. Exactly. Yeah. So that's where they got it from, I think.
Yeah.
I'll look in the books to see if they quote the Sifra. Right? In other words, that learning to accept a difficult emotion without feeling the need to fix that emotion or deny it or do something else about it, right? To just say, oh, I'm angry. Yeah. I'm hurt. I'm jealous. And then like engage in all sorts of other tools so that that emotion doesn't become the sum of our existence or dictate our actions or be the only thing that I'm focusing on. Part of it is recognizing these emotions as like feelings instead of an overwhelming reality, right? If you think for a second about,
we do that, especially with our youngest children, with like, oh, you're feeling angry, aren't you? Because they might not, like you said, they just know they're feeling bad, but they don't have the right conceptual framework necessarily to isolate what they're feeling. So helping a person to recognize what it is they're feeling is something we can do as parents.
Yeah, that's part of the emotion regulation is helping them realize that they're feeling an emotion, what that emotion is in the most defined way that they can, also what it connects to, like why you're feeling angry, and putting that into words, right? All those are different emotion regulation tools that are super important for children to be able to develop. And this is, let's say, as opposed to a child who sees something and just gets so overwhelmed that they start yelling or saying, right, I can't, I just can't, I can't. Right? In other words, that type of mode is where that the emotion is so overwhelming, is so scary that there's nothing else that they can do. There's nothing else that they can think about, nothing else that they can focus on. They have no way of coping. So we want to try and help them move away from that point, right, to develop tools so that, I'm angry, I'm furious, right? Well, we'll talk about in the practical section about how to help them with that, but that also is a way to deal with the negative emotions, right? It's a part of life. Right? Negative emotions are a part of life. And there are positive aspects of it as well, which I'll talk about also in the practical part.
Yeah, wonderful.
The Philosophy Corner.
Well, hello and welcome to the Philosophy Corner.
Good to be here.
I wanted to talk a little bit. I want to split this corner into two halves. One on the philosophy of emotions, and one on what I think is a kind of interesting area of Jewish philosophy that's really philosophical theology, which I'll explain later. Let's take it part by part. The philosophy of emotions. Philosophy of emotions is a massive field and not my field, so I feel a little bit as often in these podcasts I'm taken into areas outside of my expertise, but I feel this week even more so. So I'm feeling not just humble, but very humble, like I said we should. Relying a little bit on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a really great resource for those listeners who are interested in philosophy and want to learn more about things. Although sometimes a little bit technical because it's written by professional philosophers, mainly for professional philosophers, but it's a great free resource. The entry on emotions divides the territory, and they're focusing primarily on the last kind of 50 years worth of work in both philosophy and to some extent psychology of emotions. they divide that territory into three basic schools of thought. Okay. The first says that emotions are feelings. The second says that emotions are a type of an evaluation or a judgment. And the third say that emotions are a type of motivation. Okay. And let me explain what each means. First of all, again, they make the point, as I did earlier, that this word emotion is actually a relatively new thing, a category of mental states that might be systematically studied. It only really entered English with that meaning in the mid-19th century. When Greek philosophers and medieval philosophers would discuss emotion, they had loads of categories: passions, sentiments, affections, affect, disturbance, movement, perturbation, upheaval, or appetite. And all of these things had different meanings, and you wouldn't use one to describe the other. They just didn't have a catch-all term like the one we have for emotion. But anyway, to go through the three main schools. The feeling tradition, you could call it, that says emotions are feelings. I said, and it's a true generalization, that this encyclopedia entry focuses on the last 50 years of work, but the classical thinkers behind the feeling tradition were William James and another thinker called Lange, and that's why it's sometimes known as the James-Lange theory of emotions. What does it say? Well, it says that actually the emotion is just a feeling of bodily change. So, for example, you've got a massive release of adrenaline because you see a tiger running at you, right? The fear is just the feeling of that bodily change, and that's all fear is. It's a sensation in the body of something physiological having changed. Now, the problem with this view is it leads to this very counterintuitive consequence. I'm going to read you a quote from William James. He says, we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful. Meaning he puts the explanatory order completely the opposite way around to the way we would normally think of it. You'd normally think, why are you crying? Oh, because I'm sad. And William James says, no. Sadness just is the feeling of crying, right? And if you weren't crying, you wouldn't be sad. And that just seems totally wrong. But we'll come back to, I think when you see some of the other theories, you'll start to see why there may have been some attraction to this very counterintuitive feeling.
May I interject?
Yeah, please.
It reminded me very much of, in cognitive theory, there's what's called the cognitive triangle, which talks about the connection between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Usually when I meet with people, I talk about the cognitive pentagon, where where I add into that makes the body, like the physiological aspects of what we're feeling, and also the environment. And try really to help people recognize the difference between an emotion / feeling and our physiological, what's going on with our body. So that, in other words, that there is a difference between feeling anxiety and noticing the tightness in your shoulders. They're related to each other. One causes the other. They're connected to whatever it is. But that there is a difference between them. Maybe it's for school.
Interesting to note, especially because of what I want to get to eventually when we move from philosophy of emotions to philosophical theology in the Jewish tradition. It's worth noting that the Rambam, he would categorize all of these emotions that are felt in the body, passions, and he says God doesn't have these because God doesn't have a body. So when it says that God is angry, can't mean that, because anger is a bodily sensation and God doesn't have a body. So no such thing, right? So this notion of emotions being feelings goes back further than James and Lange. It's just that they didn't have a word for emotion, any passions, which were some emotions, whereas the James Lange theory thinks that all emotions are subtle bodily feelings. I mean, another problem with that is there are some emotions which seem to be quite distinct from one another, that seem to have exactly the same physiological signature, but they could still feel differently psychologically or emotionally. And the feeling theory can't really make sense of that. But anyway, to move on, the second theory says that feelings are actually a certain type of judgment. For instance, feeling afraid is to judge that the tiger is scary. Feeling sad is to judge that the situation has a certain property. You might call it sad inducing. Feeling happy is to judge that the situation is positive. Feeling nervous is to judge that there's a lot at stake socially, for example. This is called cognitivism about emotions, because it says that, well, emotions are just sorts of judgment. One of the obvious retorts to this is, well, no, they're not merely that's like to confuse thinking with feeling, right?
Exactly. I was going to say it's the connection between the difference between thoughts and feelings.
That's
you
right.
Sometimes have really annoying psychologists who will be like, ask them, okay, what were they feeling, or what were you feeling, right? And be like, well, I was feeling that. Oh, I don't know why he's doing that. And then I'm like, no. What were you feeling?
Were you really?
Right. In other words, I'd have that to do that. But I would note that, right? In other words, I would note that there's a difference. If I'm asking about emotions and someone's telling me their thoughts, maybe their emotions are less accessible to them, right? All sorts of things.
I teach this course called Big Questions in the Research of Man. I co-teach it with the psychologist. It's a little bit like two peas in a pod, right? Because we're a philosopher and a psychologist teaching this course.
I'm experiencing the negative emotion of jealousy right now.
Oh, I'm sorry, Aaron. You would love it. You would be brilliant as a. Maybe we'll get you in one day to present something there. But my co-lecturer, who is this psychologist, is called Asaf Kron. He's actually his speciality is the study of emotions.
Cool.
But he often gets the class to kind of vote. What do you think about X and what do you feel about X? These two things are very different. For instance, like we did a unit on free will, right? And he got the class to say, do you think we have free will? And do you feel that you have free will? And those two things can be different, right? And the problem with cognitivism, this view that emotions are just judgments, is that it seems to smudge together thinking and feeling. But I suppose that their response would be, and I'm not defending it, but I suppose the response of the cognitivist would be, if you really thought that the tiger was dangerous, you'd also feel what we call fear, and they don't really. Okay, well, there are actually two schools of cognitivism. One is more popular among philosophers, and one's more popular among psychologists. Among philosophers, the cognitivism that's most popular is called constitutive cognitivism, which says that the fear just is the judgment. There's no difference. It's just you think you can make a distinction between thinking and feeling, but no, if you really thought that the tiger was scary, that would be to be afraid. There is no gap between thinking that something is scary and being afraid. If you say, I think it's scary, but I'm not afraid, no, you're not really thinking it's scary. They are the same thing. They may be described differently. So maybe to say, you think that X is scary is a way of describing it kind of third personally, but first personally, that judgment will be felt. And if it's not felt, you're not making the judgment. The judgment and the feeling are the same thing. That's constitutivism. What's more popular among psychologists is a kind of causal story that says that no, the emotion isn't the same thing as the judgment, but it's caused by the judgment. You think that X is scary, and because you think that X is scary, you end up feeling fear. They're not the same thing, but one is the cause of the other, and the judgment is always there.
But it can't go in the opposite direction?
Not for the cognitivist.
Interesting. Right. So getting back to my cognitive pentagon, I think that it often can be going in the opposite direction.
I agree.
Sometimes I notice myself, I have like a feeling of something, and I don't know why I'm feeling something.
Yeah.
And you notice your mind is like creating like all these things, and then it's like, well, is it really like I feel angry? Why am I angry? And like figure out
shaping the way you think.
Yeah. Yeah, and like that thought might not be even like true. It's like it might not actually be what I'm thinking, but I'm looking for some type of cognitive explanation for this emotion that I'm feeling.
So cognitivists of both schools would have a little bit of trouble to make accommodating that data. The third the third theory, and I want to mention a fourth and a fifth, but just as a real aside, the third theory is motivational. That ultimately what it means to have an emotion is to be motivated to act in certain ways. So to be afraid is to be motivated to run away. To be sad is to be motivated or to lack motivation, perhaps. It's a certain type of sadness, depression. Happiness might be an eagerness to act in certain ways. And without entering into a critique of any one of these three schools, you can see that each one of them seems to be lacking quite a lot. And therefore, what's happened in the last kind of decade or so is most philosophers of emotion, but not all of them. There are some diehards in all three of the schools I've mentioned, but most philosophers of emotion want some sort of mixed account. That emotions have multiple dimensions. So there's the affective dimension, which is the dimension of motivation. There's the physiological dimension. You know, how does it affect the body? There's the phenomenological dimension. Phenomenology is how does something feel, right? What does it feel like internally? And there's the evaluative dimension, the judgment that's kind of maybe baked in somehow to an emotion, right? So to have an emotion is to view the world in a certain way. But that's just one dimension, rather than saying that's all there is to an emotion. So you have these. So now what you have are these kind of hybrid views. Those are the three main schools.
Is motivation the same as behavior, or you think that's?
Yeah, I suppose so. So that behavior would be how you measure it. It's a disposition to behave. Yeah.
I just wanted to connect all those three thoughts to the different points of my fun.
Yes. So I would
without the environment, we don't have that because it doesn't make sense.
I would connect them that way. The final theory just worth making a point of is that the emotions help to make things in your environment salient. And this is it's called the salience view of emotions. And there are different kind of colors that things in your environment can have. The color of being happy making, sad making, fear inducing, jealousy invoking. And these are ways of making things around you in various ways salient. Why is that important? Well, there's something called the search hypothesis of emotions, which says that when you try to make a decision, right? You woke up this morning, how are you going to behave? Well, there is actually an infinite number of ways in which you could behave, right? There's not a finite number of choices. You're always faced by an infinite number of choices, because you could hop, you could dance, you could swing from a tree, there's no end of things you could do, right? Which raises a computational puzzle. How do we finite human beings make decisions when there's an infinite number of possible outputs, right? So how do we pull that off? Well, says the search hypothesis of emotions, we use emotions. Our emotions make some choices more salient than others. So loads of possible choices are left out in the dark because they're not made salient, rendered salient by our emotions. Our emotions actually help us to act rationally by lighting up things in the environment, making them more salient as potential courses of behavior or action. The reason I wanted to raise this is because the Rambam thought that, as I said earlier, God has no emotions. I mean, to be anachronistic slightly, because he didn't have the word emotion, but still, I think it's fair to say that for the Rambam, God has no emotions, because he thinks that emotions only ever get in the way of reason and rationality. But according to the search hypothesis of emotions play a really important cognitive role, because they help to kind of weed out all sorts of irrelevant options that if we didn't have emotions making some choices more salient than others, we'd be stuck in this computational problem of dealing with an infinite number of choices. Weird. Right. So
indeed. Sorry.
So all I wanted to end with philosophical theologies, I happen to be really interested in the question of whether God has emotions or not. So the Rambam is very clear that God doesn't, for reasons that I said. But interestingly, he is not He's not the lone voice in Jewish philosophical theology. Stai Crescus, very, very important thinker of the 13th and 1400s. It was chief rabbi of Barcelona, a kind of intellectual descendant of the Ran and of the Ramban. He was the teacher of Rav Yosef Albo. He has a book called Or Hashem, the Light of the Lord. And he argues in there that God feels joy. Always, that God is always experiencing tremendous joy. And I think he has a kind of multi-dimensional view of what emotions are. I think he thinks that the emotion of joy has a behavioral aspect and a phenomenological aspect. The behavioral aspect of real pure joy is to be giving to another in love. When you love another person, and you give something to the person you love, you experience, where you give or receive from the person you love. When you give or receive to a person you love, you experience real pure joy. And God, says Crescus, is always giving being to the whole of the Bria, to the whole of the creation. So from every moment to moment, God is engaged in this loving action of bestowing being upon the things he loves, namely his creatures. Therefore, God is always experiencing joy, because that's what joy is. Joy is the inward experience of the outward behavior of giving to those you love.
And is it a separate? Sorry.
I would just say that. So for Crescus, joy is the only emotion that God experiences, because it overwhelms all other possible experiences. It's almost, I hate to say it, I don't mean to vulgarize, but it's almost orgasmic. It kind of takes over any other possible emotional valence. Whereas if you really want a modern Jewish theologian who thinks that God has feelings, there are two addresses. One is Avram Yehoshua Heschel, who develops what he calls a theology of pathos, where God really has feelings and he shares his feelings with his prophets. And potentially, though I have a paper forthcoming in Tradition arguing about how subtle this issue is, Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs certainly talks as if God feels stuff. He talks that way all the time. Question is, how metaphorical is Rabbi Sachs being when he talks that way is an interesting question. But I thought it would be cool to show you, and this just as a sikum, to show you the main philosophical schools about emotion and what philosophers of emotion are doing, are just trying to provide definitions, like what are emotions. And we went through those three main schools: the feeling school, the evaluation school, and the motivation school. We touched on the notion that most philosophers today have a more hybrid view of emotions. I spoke about the Salience theory of emotions, and how actually you might think that even a divine being, a being with a completely perfect mind, would require, so to speak, emotions to perform this search function. And then I touched on the Rambam, Crescus, Heschel, and Sachs debating whether God himself experiences emotions. I didn't speak about negative emotions per se, but I'll leave that for another time. I did want to just leave in passing. There's a really interesting book by Aisha Cherry called The Case for Rage, where she argues that philosophers for years have been opposed to anger. Anger is the worst emotion you could possibly feel. It corrupts reason, what we saw in the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah. But she argues that there are different forms of anger. There are forms of anger where you lose control of your behavior. That's clearly bad. There are forms of anger where you flip out because you're angry. You lose control of yourself. That's not the type of anger she's advocating for, but she thinks there's a certain sort of anger that if you didn't have it, you wouldn't be human almost, and you wouldn't be motivated to fight injustice. There's a kind of righteous indignation. Her book is inspired by the civil rights movement. So the sort of anger that Martin Luther King had, and he wanted people to feel angry at the situation, not in a destructive way, not in a way that gets you to go out and burn things down or be violent, but in a constructive way, a way that kind of burning passion to change things, which may be, rather than anger in the Jewish tradition, because kinat sofrim, or a kind of zealousness for God. there you go. Anyway, that is
I think, and that last point they mentioned, I think it relates to what I mentioned before in terms of looking in psychological testing for a little bit of aggression.
At least some aggression. Like so though I didn't focus on negative emotions, that is my summary of the philosophy corner for today. I hope it was enlightening, even though I was walking on icebergs, because
it was great. Could I ask one question about
the tips of icebergs? I mean, because there's so much hidden underneath, right? Yeah. Anyway,
in terms of Rav Chasdai Kreskas, I guess two questions. One is emotion then sort of just the flip side of behavior, or is that emotion is the result of behavior?
That's a really good question in Chasdai Kreskas scholarship. It's really not clear to me, but my inclination on reading him is he thinks that emotions have two aspects: a behavioral aspect and a phenomenological aspect. The phenomenological being the feeling, right?
Interesting.
So joy isn't complete without the behavior of giving or receiving, because joy is this two-dimensioned beast. It has the behavioral aspect and the feeling.
And I think in terms of, you mentioned that in his thought that there's only that one emotion that God experiences, but that sounds surprising to me, because we have the description of when God decides that he needs to destroy, right?
And he regrets.
The story of the flood, right? Exactly. He regrets,
right?
Right? And he's sad, right? So I would think that
Kreskas goes with the Rambam on that, on any other emotion other than joy, which he thinks would crowd, so to speak, the emotional life of the deity. Any other emotion, when the Torah describes God as having those emotions, it must be a figure of speech. And he goes Maimonidean, saying what it means is God acts as if he regrets, God acts as if he's angry, God acts as if he's, but he doesn't really have these emotions, because for Kreskas, God only has joy. But Rav Heschel, he takes all of those statements of God's emotions literally. God doesn't have a body, so when it says that God takes us out of Egypt with a strong arm, even Rabbi Heschel would admit that's a metaphor. But when it says God regrets, it means it. He regrets. And I think that this is based in the philosophy of emotions, because Rav Heschel doesn't think that regret is any sort of imperfection, nor does he think it requires a body to have it. Right? So since it's not an imperfection, and since it doesn't require a body, God could feel regret and should feel regret, because that's the appropriate feeling when humanity has descended to the depths of degradation that the Torah could describe it as rak ra kol hayom, only evil all day long. God regrets. Why wouldn't he regret? Is how Rav Heschel would respond.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
The practical corner.
I mean, I think we did touch on some practical aspects in the earlier parts of this episode, but I did want to get a little bit more focused on specific things. A model that I've mentioned is often for helping parents deal with their children's anxiety. It's called SPACE, developed by this psychologist named Dr. Ellie Leibowitz in America, and it stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. Okay, so that's the acronym, and a part of what it does is, I'm oversimplifying just for the purpose of this episode, but what it gives, it focuses very much on helping parents reduce accommodating behaviors for their child's anxiety. In other words, all sorts of things that parents do in order to help their child because their child is in distress, but have the negative consequence of prolonging their dealing with anxiety. Because what anxiety really is a feeling of I cannot cope with what's going on here, so I need to engage in all sorts of other behaviors in order to protect myself. So for example, parents, you're talking about a child who's dealing with social anxiety, parents who would speak on behalf of their child, so they're doing it for their child's benefit, right? My child is not able, right? In other words, in their mind, my child's not able to speak to others, so I will help them out. but it just ends up prolonged because it ends up really causing the child to feel like, okay, no, I can't, right? Look, my parents are speaking on my behalf. I can't speak for myself. It is too scary. So the way that the model suggests reducing the accommodation is for parents to act towards their child in two ways. Firstly is by validating their difficult emotions. In other words, saying, I understand that for you, this is difficult. This is scary. This feels overwhelming, which is for some parents comes naturally, and others, it can be very challenging, right? Because the way that they respond usually to their child's anxious behavior is by saying, "Oh, shtuyot," right? This is just like so and so. Like, just get over it. Like, what's the big deal? I don't understand. Like, I was scared of this when I was your age, and just got over it. So you need to get over it too. Or like, no one's scared of this. Look at your brother. Look at your sister. They're completely fine. Why are you making a big deal out of it? So although that also usually comes from a big place, right? A good place, excuse me, trying to motivate the child and push them forward, it ends up making the child feel that their emotions are invalid. Right? And that's what I wanted to bring it up in terms of the second step is then expressing to the child the confidence that they can deal with, right? In other words, that anxiety is scary, but it's not dangerous, and it's something that you can deal with it. You'll find it more difficult in the beginning, but we believe in you, right? And that's getting rid of the accommodating behaviors from the other direction of, okay, I'll speak on your behalf because it is too scary for you. You're not really able to do it. But in terms of that first step of validating a child's emotional experience, that can be really beneficial because of the fact that if you're not validating the child experience, so that lack of validation can often have the effect of the child needing to show you, no, you don't think this is scary. I will show, not in a manipulative, conscious way, right? But I need to show you that this is scary. In other words, that if you see someone who's about to eat a poison apple, okay, and you say, stop, that's a poison apple, don't eat it, and they say, yeah, whatever you're talking about, right? I'm fine, apples are fine, and they keep bringing the apple closer and closer to their mouth. So you see what they're doing is dangerous. So the more that they ignore your warnings and validate what it is that you're saying, the more you're going to raise your response, right? And say, no, this is dangerous, this is scary, stop, yelling, screaming, throwing things to that degree. And then once the other person, and this is, I think, something that's very relevant also in terms of debate and disagreement with others, right? And there is that often when we're disagreeing with other people and saying, oh, your opinion is invalid, is ridiculous, right? And then that's just, no one's really talking to each other, right? Just yelling my own thoughts to the void, and they're doing the same. But once you give that other person a little bit of space, then that can really make a big difference. And the same is true with regards, like I was saying, to the negative emotions, that being able to validate them does take away a little bit of their state, right? Because the other person feels seen.
This idea of validating a person's emotions, I mean, it brings to mind a network of closely related philosophical discussions about emotions that I didn't get into in the philosophical corner. One of them is called voluntarism, which is the view that you have direct control over what you're feeling, and there's a big debate about that, right? And the consensus, a consensus, I don't know if that's fair. The majority view among philosophers is that no, you don't have direct, immediate control over what you're feeling, but you might be able to have control over a long period of time, over the sort of person you are, so the sort of emotional profile you have in general. You can't just switch on a switch that makes you empathetic, maybe, but you can work on empathy over the long term and become a more empathetic person over a period of time. Why is this relevant? Well, one model of psychology, it's a very crude model of psychology, is we need to change the way you're feeling. You're presenting feelings, emotions that are negative, that are harming you or harming people around you. We need to somehow change the way you're feeling. Another model of psychology, another crude model of psychology, got to accept the way you're feeling. Kind of Eastern inspired, Buddhist, maybe Indian inspired philosophy is, well, your feelings are just, they're just there. They're a fact. They're a datum. And we have to learn to accept them, to recognize them. And where perhaps a more sophisticated psychology has got to is that actually you need to notice and accept your emotions in order to change them over the long term. Meaning neither side is right, or neither side was right or wrong. Both sides had a kernel of truth to them.
Yeah.
And why is that relevant? Because what you're saying is, if your child suffers from anxiety, let's say, or I think it would probably be any negative emotion, is to validate that, to say, oh, I really understand how bad that must feel, etc., and then to give them the space to, as you said, the space to kind of, what would be the right word? The space to encounter the anxiety making situations or whatever on their own, the space to kind of navigate them on their own.
Yeah, I think it's more, it's a lot of it is about widening your perspective. Whereas if I want to help my child get over a negative emotion, I don't need to tell them, don't feel this way. Right.
Yeah, because you can't change your emotions.
Yeah.
You can't change on a dime. You can't just.
Yeah, we don't have control over our emotions. I mentioned, I don't know why, every like few months this skit by Bob Newhart gets into my head. A comedian from the 1980s in America. I don't know if he made it to your shores. But there's this one skit. I think he had a comedy show. I don't know. But there's this one skit where he plays a psychiatrist. And this woman comes to see him, and he says, I've developed a model of therapy that helps people in 5 minutes. She's like, wow, that's amazing. And I think she starts talking about things that she's anxious about, that she's fearing, the way that it controls her life. And he says, it's easy, just stop it. Right? Just stop it. She's like, no, you don't understand. I can't, like, I'm it's taking over my life. It's controlling me. I don't know what to do. He said, yeah, okay, just stop it. Stop. And then this goes back and forth. She gets very angry, and then I think she makes like something comparing him to like her mother, father, whatever, one of her parents, and he's like, no, we don't go there. we're not going to talk about it, right? We're not going to talk about what this brings up from your childhood.
Your parents or your past,
right? So telling people it can help, right? Like don't be scared. Now, the idea is like push, like just push, motivate yourself. And there are points in your life where that is helpful. But usually if a child is dealing with a negative emotion, just telling them, stop it, don't feel that way, is not going to help, because we can't really control our emotions. We can choose sometimes what to focus on, which is what this is going to second practice on. Yeah.
There's almost a paradox here, because it's saying that in the long run, I can help you overcome your anxiety, but the road to overcoming your anxiety is a road on which acceptance is one of the first steps.
Yeah.
First, you have to accept the anxiety and recognize it, come to know it, to recognize that it's bad and that it's not nice to feel it, and to have that corroborated or affirmed by those around you who love you and say, yeah, that's tough. Somewhat paradoxically, that's the first step to overcoming the anxiety altogether, and to please God, leaving it behind.
Yeah, very much true. Very much so. And it is a lot, I think, like I was saying, about widening perspective. So in the space model, it's recognizing the anxiety and adding to that although anxiety can feel scary, it's not actually dangerous. And also keeping in mind your ability to cope. Right? In other words, I'm confident I can handle this, even though it is scary. And the second model, the second practical point that I want to speak about is very much related to what you spoke about in terms of different schools of thought in philosophy and then in psychology, a method of therapy that I've spoken about a lot, called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, where it has both those elements, right? There's the acceptance, right? Accepting whatever difficult thought and feeling it is that you're experiencing, not trying to get rid of it, to push it away, to say, oh, I don't feel that way. I shouldn't feel that way. That feeling is wrong. That thought is inaccurate, is whatever it is irrational, but rather accepting it, right? Because then that can take away a little bit of the emotional impact of it, like I was saying. And then the second step is commitment, right? Taking committed action towards the life that you want to live. And the way that you do that is you once again widen your perspective. You remember that there's other things going on. So for example, speaking a lot about anxiety, it's true not just in let's talk about a different negative emotion, right? Jealousy. Okay. So in jealous of so-and-so because of the new watch that they bought. It's beautiful. I wish I had a watch like that, right? So I can say, don't be jealous. It's a bad character trait. It's forbidden, right? It's one of the 10 commandments. Forbidden. Stop doing it, right? Sometimes I'll be successful at pushing myself to not think that, but many times not. And what I could do according to this model is accept it, right? Say, okay, I accept the fact that I'm jealous, and what that means, right? It means that I'm human, right? The reason it's in the 10 commandments is because it's something that is important, but it's something that, right? There's a reason that eating bugs is not in the 10 commandments, right? Because it's not something that people normally, whatever, Daf Yomi recently, right? It's not something that people specifically strive to eat bugs. So it's a sign also of how challenging it can be. So that's accepting and taking a little bit of the sting out of it, but not to the degree of, oh, well, okay, who cares anyways, right? So, nobody cares about being jealous or working on yourself. But then taking committed action towards the life that I want to live. I don't want to be jealous. So what other aspects of my life or my viewpoint can I also bring to the forefront? So for example, I might be jealous of this person, but think for a second also of the positive feelings I have towards this person, right? Do I have, in addition to the jealousy, is there also a part of me that's maybe happy for him or proud of them or joyful in what it is that they have? And maybe to understand also a little bit about where that jealousy comes from in terms of my own feelings, and to focus on also things about myself that I'm very grateful to be blessed. In other words, that jealousy and gratitude can sometimes be viewed as flip sides of each other, right? Thinking about what it is that I appreciate about my life, and also taking committed action towards living the life that I want to live. Okay, what does this feeling of jealousy cause me to do? It causes me to think about how I can spend hours looking online at various watches. Does that help my life? No, it doesn't help my life. Okay, so maybe next time that I notice this jealous feeling, if I give it a little bit of space and I accept it, then it'll enable me, instead of being triggered and making me look for hours on watch websites, I'll say, okay, that's a hard feeling. I don't want to be getting caught up in the websites right now. So I'm going to use a different tool, drop anchor, and then go ahead and call a friend and have a nice conversation with them, or learn a little bit, or play with my children, whatever it is.
Here's a question that one might raise about the ACT model in general. The A is for acceptance. We've been talking about that in the first 2 points here of both in space and in ACT. There's in both of those models, there's this notion of acceptance, but we're talking about negative emotions that we've defined ex hypothesis as bad, emotions we would rather not have. So what exactly do you mean? Maybe I'm asking an obvious question, but it might be worth spelling out. What exactly do we mean by acceptance? Because surely it doesn't mean that you have to say, oh, my jealousy is not so bad. I accept it because I'm human. It's okay. It's fine. Or my anxiety is not so bad if it's crippling you. Does acceptance require one to deny the negativity of the emotion?
So I think now we're getting into more philosophical territory. I think that
that's what I do.
in the perhaps most Eastern views of this type of therapy, it can be incredibly non-judgmental, right? Maybe even positive and negative are just words, and it just is.
Yeah.
And I think there's a spectrum of acceptance going from perhaps tolerance to that other end that I just mentioned now. And I think, that there is a certain way in which this philosophy is...
It doesn't look
Sorry,
good.
just finish that. I think that there's a certain way where this philosophy is at odds with our tradition, and that we can still make use of it and say, no, there are certain absolutes, there are values that we can say, there is good, there is bad, and acceptance can mean understanding where it's coming from, not actively trying to push it out, recognizing that there may be positive aspects of it, which I'll speak about shortly also.
But I was saying, I mean, even on the most extreme version that perhaps is at odds with our tradition, it's not asking you to say that these emotions are good. It's saying good and bad don't come into it, which still may be at odds with our tradition, but at least it's not asking you to say that they're good. And what you're saying is that we can perhaps adapt acceptance to be more compatible with the Jewish outlook. Acceptance as kind of noticing what it is and accepting that is how you're feeling, and accepting your humanity or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Next, practical point number 3.
Yeah.
See how far I can knock you off course with the question.
So maybe because of that segue that we just had, so I'll skip ahead and make a different one. Number 3 is also in terms of kids, helping them also be aware of the positive aspects of negative emotions also. So for example, right, we have the pasuk, that the jealousy that exists amongst scribes increases wisdom, right? So capitalism of knowledge, right? In other words, that the sense of jealousy and competition can actually push people forward. And this is true with regards to a lot of negative emotions, like on a number of levels, right? So fear as an emotion, there's a positive aspect. There's a reason that we experience fear is because it's a sign that it's the goal of fear in our lives is to make sure that we stay safe. Whereas we would not want to get rid of fear. And it's connected to being careful about things. And it's important to be careful about things also, right? To not just do things haphazardly. And very often, many negative emotions are a sign of positive potential as well. In other words, experiencing sadness and heartbreak are the natural consequences of opening oneself up to potential love and care. In other words, and this is also as traumatic, right? I wouldn't want to live a life in which there is no sad. I was speaking to someone recently about it, right? Had a parenting dilemma that they wanted to not do something with their child because they felt like eventually this type of thing would have to end and then their child would experience disappointment. I said, I mean, disappointment is a part of life. Like one day after 120 years, like we're not going to be here anymore. And God willing, our children will still be alive then. And they're going to be sad about that. Right. But that's because of the fact that we worked so hard on having a relationship. So do we want to prevent them from experiencing that sadness? And the way that we'll do it is by not having a nice connection with them, so it won't affect them so much when we're no longer here. No, God forbid. Right? The negative emotions often have the meaning behind them is that you took a chance, right? That there is some desire to have the positive as well.
And your point is this is something we can help our children to recognize.
Yeah. It's a normal part of being human, and it's also a sign of being a functioning human being too. So another thing in terms of kids is the importance in my mind of helping them differentiate between emotions and behaviors, setting boundaries. Right. So in terms of, so validating the emotional experience. So, okay, fine. So if my kid is angry, so what validating anger means is that it's okay that he starts throwing things, or that she punches her little sister, or whatever it is. So no, right? That's not what validation means. That it's important to recognize that I can feel all sorts of things. I can express those emotions, but that doesn't give me the license to necessarily act upon those emotions, right? That we can draw a boundary. We should draw a boundary. That's also an important counter to perhaps to what I said earlier.
Yeah.
So in our home, that's what we try to do. Others, they say, it's okay. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be angry at me, or mommy, or your siblings, or yourself, right? I get angry too. That's part of things. We try to work on things so we don't get as angry, right? Because it's not an emotion that we enjoy, right? And it's also one that we need to be careful with. But it's a part of life that we sometimes get angry. The question is, what do we do with that anger?
Yeah,
right?
You're not allowed to hit.
Yes,
and I don't know if this is in conflict with Jewish values of not wasting things, of bal tashchit, but we used to sometimes say to our kids, if they were in a terrible temper, that they could take a piece of paper and tear it up into little bits, or something like that. Some way of expressing their anger that wouldn't require them to do something worse, right? That wouldn't require them to hit somebody or shout at somebody. But I suppose in doing that, as a practical tip, in doing that, we were modeling what you're saying, which is to recognize that you are allowed to feel that way. That's you're a human.
Yeah.
What's not okay is how some of the ways in which that feeling might manifest in behavior.
Yeah. So some behavior, each family should figure out what behavior, is it okay to punch a pillow, to throw a pillow, to slam a door, right? Every family needs their own rules, right? And parents should have like a set uniform thing, and should make sure also that they act on it too, right? If the rule in the home is that we don't slam doors because we're angry, so parents also should make sure to not do that too.
Well, I had an opportunity to visit recently a school for children with emotional difficulties, and the school had a room with a punch bag in. And when kids who were really they really needed to release some anger or pent up frustration, they would go and thrash this punch bag. Some people might not like that because it might be too close to kind of encouraging violence, but the school found it a useful way of it directed that emotion at something inanimate rather than, God forbid, hurting somebody.
They have an important place. The last thing I'll mention is in terms of helping children develop cognitive flexibility, which is that together with accepting and validating what it is that children are feeling, even negative emotions, to help them slowly see that it's possible that there are other ways to feel in that same reality. Meaning that...
What does that mean? Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So my child was incredibly insulted by something. So to try and understand their experience and say, yeah, you know what? I really understand why that hurt your feelings so much. It could be I've experienced things like that, and it's hurt my feelings in the past too. And you have to be careful about this, because potentially presenting other ways to feel about it may cross the line to become invalidating at some point, to say, oh, your response isn't correct. But to figure out sometimes at points, maybe afterwards, I was thinking more about it, and I was wondering, do you think it's possible that when that person said so-and-so, what they actually meant was this? Or maybe when they were insulting you, I wonder why they were insulting you. Do you think maybe they're jealous of you, or that they were hurt by something else? Or is it that you're giving them flexibility? It's both about flexibility, other ways that they could potentially have felt in that situation, and or like adding additional layers of complexity to it. So, that person insulted you, and then your friend rushed in and said something in your defense. And what did that feel like? But did you notice that? Did you feel like they had your back and you felt supported and loved by them, for example?
It sounds like you're helping the child to reframe the original incident, either by offering them alternative reactions, but also alternative interpretations. In your last example, where you say, "And how did you feel when your friend came to your aid," or something, it's about broadening the perspective rather than focusing on one little incident, seeing it as part of a larger.
Yeah, it doesn't need to only be the event as it actually occurred. In other words, you could also help them, not usually in the moment, but maybe later on, like, oh, well, how would you have felt if instead of the person saying it this way, they had said it like slightly differently, or if you had responded.
And I think the reason you're saying later on is because you don't want to invalidate, right? So this is a strategy that you don't necessarily use in the heat of the moment. You use.
It depends also on the child, because of the fact that younger children are not as able to get complexity. That's a skill that we get as we get older, right? So in other words, if mom or dad are saying, "Oh, there's another possibility," what they mean is that mine is wrong. It's very black and white at younger ages. So they're not going to be able to, definitely in a moment, to be able to say, to understand that, no, like, I understand what you're saying and I get it. But, right, in other words, the but for them, like, wipes out everything you've said up until then. And as adults too, that happens at different points, right? Or we don't want to, in the heat of the moment, like, hear excuses or justifications or additional layers of meaning. Like, it can be hard for us too.
Yeah. I agree. When I'm burning with indignation, I don't need somebody to reframe it for me. Thank you very much. But when I calm down, maybe it'd be useful. Yeah. I hear.
Those are the practical points I had today.
Well, unsurprisingly, I have nothing to add when it comes to practicalities.
Besides for all the things that you said.
besides from all the things that I added. Yeah, thanks, Aaron. That was very affirming.
I was trying to add an additional layer of complexity to what it was, like you said.
Well, that's nice. That's nice. Well, we'll leave our listeners this week with these thoughts on negative emotions. Join us sometime soon.
And if this episode made you angry, that's okay. You can tell us about it.
That's right.
Just don't unsubscribe.
All right. Bye.